Hello and welcome to Nanapod, a podcast dedicated to the fantastic manga written by A. Yazawa. I'm Crystal, and I'm joined by my best girl Kirsten as we dissect this manga, discussing everything from the emotions, the cultural impact, as well as any headcanons that might be floating around in our brains. With this podcast, we hope to preserve a shoujo staple that sadly hasn't been talked about in a very long time. So come with us. We're waiting for you in apartment 707. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nanapod. So we are picking up here in chapter 63, and we have the narration that says, "But guilt came running after me. The next morning I took the first train out to my parents' place as if I was running away. I spent that night alone in Shirogane. I couldn't sleep at all." And now there's the ring of a phone, and a hand is reaching for it, and it goes beep, and there is a blonde gentleman driving a car on the other end, and he's like, "Good morning, Shin. I'll be there in 15 minutes. What room are you in?" And Shin says, "Sorry, I just woke up. I'm running a little late. Can you just wait for me down in the lobby?" And the driver's like, "Okay." And then we get a shot of him and his madam. They are in bed together. And then there's a creak of the wardrobe, and he's looking through all of these clothes, and he pulls out a shirt and says, "Whose is this?" And she says, "Tomo's, heart." He says, "Can I borrow it?" She says, "Sure, I bought it." He can't complain. And then Shin's pointing it on, and he's like, "The sleeves are too short." And she's like, "They are? Then stop growing, or you won't be cute anymore." Which is really gross because, well, we all know that she is a groomer, and what it appears, at least this is how I'm choosing to read it, it appears that Shin isn't her only young individual that she grooms. Because the sleeves are short. So, anyway, he's like, "Not possible. I'm a living thing." And she says, I guess there are a lot of tall Scandinavians. Damn." And he just kind of looks down. And it's like, oh, he's gross and fetishistic. I don't like it. Anyway. Now we have some letters over here that says Mr. Genshiro Suzuki. And Fo Masato says, "These are my grandfather's diaries and the letters that Nana's mother wrote to him." And she goes on to say to Yasu, "Grandpa died when I was in 9th grade. He died suddenly of a heart attack. My parents didn't pay much attention to me because they were so busy working. And Grandma died when I was little, so I was really close to my grandfather. He was my rock. I was in total shock. I shut myself up in his room and just cried for days." And then there's a tap as Yasu flicks his cigarette, and she says, and then she starts to cry, and then says, "I'm sorry." And he says, "There's nothing to apologize for. You want another cup of coffee?" And she says, "Thank you." And then she says, "And then you found your grandpa's diaries and started reading them?" And there's a glug glug of the coffee, and she says, "Yeah." "And you found out that Nana's grandma was your grandpa's mistress from reading his diaries?" She says, "Yeah." Says, "Miyuki lost her husband in Tokyo and then went back to her hometown with Miss Suzu, who was still little. She started working the nightlife scene to make ends meet. That's how she got to know my grandfather." And she says, "I think my grandpa gave her the money to open the restaurant." And Yasu says, "I guess Nana doesn't know about that. She always talked about her grandma being so strict." And Fo Masato says, "I'm sure it was all hush-hush. You wouldn't want your daughter or granddaughter to know about it. And Yasu says, you weren't surprised your grandpa had a mistress, Masato? And she's like, yeah, I was surprised. But I could tell that Grandpa loved both Grandma and Miyuki, and was torn apart by his conflicted feelings. So it's not that shocking. Till the day he died, Grandpa worried about Misuzu and Nana. And we get a shot here of what he wrote in his diary. It says, September 3rd. Today I saw Nana around town. I hadn't seen her in a while. She was with a cute boy and looked so happy. I've never seen her look so alive. I was surprised. I asked if he was her boyfriend. She told me they started a band, and he's one of her bandmates. In any case, I'm happy for her. Miyuki in heaven must be too. And then Masato says, by the time I reached the last page, I realized how obsessed I'd gotten with Nana. So then... And then she kind of stops, and Yasu says, but why? And she says, I never thought about why. I get really obsessed with characters in the books I read and stuff. I don't know why. And Yasu laughs, and he's like, maybe Grandpa was a great writer. Or, Masato has a lot of the problem the fandom does, where, they create parasocial relationships with individuals, even though Nana's real. And he says, I see. And she says, but then she started a band and got really outgoing and active. Makes you wonder what sort of magic happened. And then Yasu says, and then you went to see Nana play a show. And she says, yeah. And now Masato looks like she's in a completely different manga. She looks like she's in The Rose of Versailles. And that, the artist... Oh, who did that? Ryoko Akita has drawn her instead of Yazawa. Like, all the flowers and her eyes are different. It's actually a really pretty panel, but it's very funny. I was like, girl, you're not even in this manga anymore. And she's like, I fell in love with her at first sight. And then Yasu's just thinking of Nana on stage, and it has a sweat bead. Like, okay. And then... she goes on to say, Grandpa had introduced me to Nana in the past, so I wouldn't be so lonely. Later, I thought of these connections and was psyched. And then I had the will and energy to live. And Yasu smiles and says, did you ever meet Nana's mother? And she says, no, I didn't. Her last letter to my grandpa was to cut him out of her life, so I thought I should just leave it alone. And then... she says, I want to forget my past. Please just leave me alone. That's what it said. And then Yasu says, so Nana's mother wasn't really missing. She says, no, I think that's just what Nana was told by her grandmother. I don't think Miyuki and Misuzu got along very well. And Grandpa tried keeping them in touch by acting as a go-between. He was worried and went to see her several times. And Yasu has picked up the letter. And it says Misuzu Osaki and Meguro ku Tokyo. But for Misuzu, it was an inconvenience. She says, the last letter is the one with the 88 postmark. And he goes on to... Yasu says, the last letter is the one with the 88 postmark. That's a long time ago. And she says, I know. It was around the time she married Mr. Uehara and had Masato. She finally had the stable life she wanted. I think you'd understand Nana's mother better if you read that letter and the diaries, instead of listening to me with my biases. And Yasu says, no, I can't do it. I don't want to read other people's diaries and letters. And she's like, oh, sorry. And it has like all the blush lines. And he says, well, if I were in your situation, Masato, I probably would have read them. But it's not my family. And she looks real sad. And then he says, what I want to know is not so much about Nana's mother's past, which we can't do anything about, but about the present and how you're doing. And she looks over at him, and he says, why are you so worried? And she says, well, I'm just worried about Nana. And he says, I don't think Nana would figure out her relationship to Misato Uehara by just talking for a while at the thank you party. It would have been too weird to stop them from talking to each other. And then she says, but what if Nana's little sister is approaching Nana because she knows they're sisters? I'm afraid she'll say something that'll hurt Nana, even if she means well. And Yasu says, okay, but she's like, yeah, I understand that she's just a fan. That's good. But Nana really gets involved with her fans, so, and he says, yeah, I think we should be careful that they don't get any closer. But if you're so obviously considerate about Nana, then why did you start using her sister's name? And she says, I know, it was a bad idea. And then Yasu says, I'm not accusing you. I see a conflict of interest here. And she says, I feel that too. I gave in to a childish desire pretending to be Nana's younger sister. In my mind, I was bragging that I knew the most about Nana out of all of the fans. And he's like, go on. And she says, so even when the other fangirls were mean to me, I didn't care. I started investigating a lot about the rest of you too. My curiosity was insatiable and I got carried away. I started following you guys. Things got weird. Yeah, Masato, it is weird. You have like entire albums that are just dated Nana and the years in your house. It's weird. And then she says, I'm so sorry. And then Yasu says, well, I was just thinking about things in a complicated way. You have your reasons. Everyone's torn between some kind of fear and desire. And then she looks over at him and says, so you're like that too, Yasu? And he says, of course. If you investigated us that thoroughly, you should know. Why even pretend I'm not? And then she has the dots and a sweat bead and says, but to be honest, the more I find out about you, the more of a mystery you are. There's so much I want to ask. And he's cut blush lines and a sweat bead and said, everyone thinks I'm hard to understand. I don't try to be aloof or a loner. And then she's kind of smiling and there's a knock knock. And it's Genpai. He's like, oh, Yasu, heart, it's almost time. And he says, all right, I'll be out soon. Can you wait in the car? And then he stands up and says, sorry, we'll have to talk about this again some other time. And she says, yes, thank you so much. And he's standing up and putting on his jacket with a sweat bead and says, but if Nana's mother is like that, if we contact her, she'll just ignore us. She's got to watch out for the paparazzi. And Fomasato says, but I don't think the gossip mags will print unauthorized articles about Shikai's talent. It'd cost him too much to risk that. And he looks back at her and she says, we should think about what to do if they give us a heads up. And he's like, you're right. I was wondering why we have to belong to an agency like this, but there are some advantages. And she says, yeah, we just have to stay positive and work it. And then he's got a smile like, that's very optimistic of you. And then the think boxes say, even back at my parents' place, it felt like Search was keeping an eye on me, and I didn't feel like going out. And her sister, her older sister, was like, you don't look well, Nana. And she looks over and says, what? And she says, I'm fine, heart. And then her dad's like, then eat more. A pregnant lady's got to eat for two. And her mother's like, all right, dear, that doesn't mean you should be eating for two. And then her dad says, and have you and Takumi been keeping in touch over the phone? And she says, yeah, heart. And he's like, really? What'd I ask? And then her sister, I think it's Nami, has the dots. Oh, it isn't Nami. Oh, Nami's the other one. Damn it. Anyway, and he's like, so where's Nami? This is a family dinner night. What's she doing? And then the think boxes are like, Takumi won't call me on his own. He's just like that. It's not that he doesn't love me. I know that. She's thinking about what the mosquito said. You sacrificed yourself to keep her relationship with Ren's secret. And now we are with Trap Nest. And is this Naoki? I think it's Naoki. He's like, hey, Heart, why don't we go somewhere in Europe when we get time off next week? Like France or Germany? And Takumi says, why do we have to do everything together? Sit down, dude. And one of their handlers has the dots. And Rira says, I'm going to Sweden. And Naoki says, really? Cool, Heart. And Ren says, do they have a good ramen shop there? I want to go too. Dude, like, I'm pretty sure that Ren is still doing drugs at this point. Like, his cravings for ramen are insane. And Naoki says, me too! And he's got all these hearts. And Rira says, N-O, I'm going by myself. And then Naoki's heart is broken. And he says, but why? And she says, I'm going with the lover in my heart. And then she stands up and the boys are looking at her like, oh? And Takumi's got dots. And then Naoki's like going over to Takumi and says, who's that? Yasu? Why Sweden? He's so out of the loop. It's so funny. And then Takumi's like, I don't know. Don't ask me. And then Ren says, should we let her go alone? And Takumi says, it's fine. She's not a child. And then Naoki says, but can Rira speak Swedish? She'll need an interpreter. And their handler says, most Swedish people speak English too. And Naoki says, really? Takumi says, she'll be fine. And then Ren says, that's not what I'm worried about. And then he throws his spoon down into his foods, and then there's a splash. And he stood up and walked away, and Takumi's looking over like, the fuck? And he's walked over to Rira. And now the mosquito, he's like, but it's a fact that they spent the night together in Ren's room. Even if you say it's not possible. Even in bed, I was consumed with uneasiness and doubt. I couldn't breathe and I couldn't move, like I was paralyzed. And you know what? I think, once again, this is another reason why the readers are reading way too much into Ren and Rira's relationship. Like, they're just friends, and Ren knows that, like, Takumi's not taking responsibilities for feelings or anything like that. So he's kind of stepping up and trying to fill the lonely void for Rira because he's a good friend. But they're not fucking. Like, guys, they're not. Anyway. So the mosquito's like, don't tell anyone about this. And she's like, maybe I should talk to someone about it. I kept worrying until another sleepless night came to end. And then there's a ring of a phone. And she wakes up and goes across the room to grab it with a beep. It says, incoming email, December 26th at 5:48 in the morning. It says, Nana, good morning. I couldn't sleep, so I watched the DVD of the movie you said you really liked, and it put me to sleep. Smiley face. Thanks, heart. Good night, heart. But Hachi looks really worried and says, I can't just do nothing. When this article goes to print, that photo will disappear, the mosquito said. And she's like, I don't believe Karada can promise something like that. And there was a beep, and she's like, I can't take it anymore. Somebody help me. And she called Takumi, and he says, I'm telling you, they're playing you. And she's in bed crying, and she says, what? And he says, like, they wouldn't try to trade you a scandal that big for something so small. No way. And I'm sure that picture was photoshopped. And she says, it's not something that small. And he says, it's all relative. Did you get a good look at the photo? And now she's got the dots, and she's like, yeah. And he said, did you take a really good look at it? And now she's got the dots. And she's like, well, I saw it. And he says, that's a doctored photo for sure. Well, all right.
see you, heart. And she's like, hey, wait! And he's like, if you're so worried, why don't you ask Shin? If he was making out with Rira in public somewhere, I don't think he's that stupid. And she says, well, if it's a fake photo, can't you stop the article from coming out? You seem to be good at things like that. Sarcastic. And he says, don't ask me. Not my problem. Why don't you talk to Baldy about it? Which is interesting because she almost did. So, like, Hachi. Remember, like, all those episodes ago when Lisa and I were like, there's Zeus and Hades. So, like, right now, she's talking to Hades. She gotta go talk to Zeus. And she gets real mad, and she's like, that's it, you jerk. And she hangs up on him, and Takumi's like, what? He's just very, very confused. And then he's thinking, well, she said that's it, so I guess that's it. That's not... Oh, Takumi, you're just such a clueless dude. And then he walks back into the other room, and there's this fancy lady who kind of looks like another version of Hachi, honestly. And she's like, Takumi, heart. And he smiles and goes over and kisses her. Kisses her, like, on the cheek. But Hachi's spiraling over here. And she's like, he's cold-hearted. Takumi's too cold. He's not human. Even if there's nothing he can do, he could at least give a crap, show some emotion. He sold us out as a scoop to search and didn't even tell me. And she's got all the dots. And she's like, but now's not the time to worry about that. And she's like, beep, I should have called Yasu first. Yes. Then Nami bursts in with a bam of the door and says, hey, big sis. And she's like, why is everyone always messing me up? If you're gonna stay out all night, come in quietly. Just let me call Yasu. And then her sister's like, have you seen this? Isn't it the worst? I mean, her parents? And Hachi looks over and she sees the Search magazine and it says, Nana selfishly abandoned by her real mother. Blackstone's Nana's eternal loneliness, the truth behind it all. And she's got like the, oh my god. And she grabs it and is like, what is this? And Nami says, I bought it at the corner store. She's like, but Search comes out on Thursdays. And Nami says, really? But it was for sale. And Hachi's thinking, how? I didn't think it'd come out this fast. And Nami's like, what's wrong? And she's thinking, I didn't even know. I thought I could do something about it all by myself. And she's thinking about Takumi saying they're playing you. And she's like, how could I be so stupid? And now we have, the newsstands with this article on it. And who's this guy? This is Real Masato's older brother. And he has picked up the vintage Auto Z. And the store clerk says, were you out all night, Takahiro? He says, boo. And he's like, you scared me. Kirado, I didn't see you there. And then he says, it's me, Kirado, dude. Well, obviously, you just said your name. Yeah, he's like, that's what I said. And he's like, no, you didn't. What the fuck? And then there's a beep as he buys the magazine. And then this clerk says, you lucky dog, Takahiro. You have a fun, sweet girlfriend, even though she's not the hottest. That's so rude. And he's like, where did you see her? And he says, Mrs. Yamamoto told me. And now he's got a question mark and says, who's that? The hills have eyes. And then Kitaro says, P.S. By the way, did you tell Masato yet that I like her? Aren't you a bit old for her, dude? Anyway, he's got like the tics and he's like, why should I tell her anything? Because Masato acts like I don't exist, says Kitaro. He says, it's always blast this and blast that. She doesn't notice you because you're unnoticeable, says Takahiro. And then the guy's got the And then he's like, oh, I get it. I just suck. I'm just a loser. You know what? Yes. And then Takahiro's got the dots. And then he's like, look, I'll fix you two up to go visit some shrine together on New Year's. The rest is up to you. And he's like, really, man? Dude, don't set your sister up with this dude. Anyway, he's like, well, even though you're a ghost, Kirado, she's known since she was little that you're a good guy. Is he, though? And he's like, it's Kitaro. And then Takahiro says, I'd rather her be with you than have her drooling over some celebrity, and a lady one at that. Takahiro, don't be homophobic, dude. That's just... It's 2001. It's 2001. It's still... I've never liked that kind of language, so it can be both and. And then there's a ring of his phone, and he opens it and it says, please tell Masato thank you for Yasu's autograph. Don't forget, Keiyoko. And he smiles, and then he's typing beep, beep, beep with a heart. And then he looks over, and there are two gentlemen standing in front of his house. And then he's like, what are you guys doing in front of my house? Because one of them has a camera. And he's like, who are you? And this guy turns around and says, are you Miss Uehara's son? And he's like, yeah? And then this different mosquito man is like, I'm from Women Weekly. Can I talk to you for a minute? And then we get a shot of Masato in her bedroom, just sleeping with his ease. And then all of a sudden, her brother bursts in with a bam and says, Masato. And she wakes up and he says, don't go outside. And she says, what? And then he says, don't open the curtains. And she's like, what? Why? I'm going out with Fujimoto today. And he says, just listen to me, all right? And then she is looking at him like, oh no, what's going on? And now we are back at the dorms with the Search magazine on the table. It's Genpai, and says the president knew about this coming out, but he decided it would be good publicity. Nana will be really bummed to find out that this was her real mother's like. That this is what her real mother's like. And Fomasato was crying, and Shin says, do you really think so? I don't think Nana will care too much about it. But Nobu says, how could she not? And then Shin stands up and says, but that's just how someone who's attached to their parents would feel. I mean, it might bother you a little. When you're younger, maybe. But to Nana at this point, what does it matter what her mother's doing now? She'd want it to go away. And then Shin's got the dots. And then now he's yelling with blush lines and says, well, maybe you're right, but still. And then Shin says, give me some cigs, heart. And then Genpai says, well, there's no point in us deciding how she'll feel about it. I'll be brave and go tell her. What a thankless job. And Fomasato says, I'll go with you. And then Nobu says, I'll go too. Yasu says, Nobu, you should go by yourself. And Nobu says, what? And then Shin's just kind of got like this, oh, okay, look. And then Nobu says, I don't know how Nana will feel when she sees the article. And Yasu says, but she'll hate all of us for feeling sorry for her, that's for sure. It's best if just you go. And Shin says, agreed. And Fomasato says, you're right. And then Genpai says, that's a good idea. And Nobu's like, but why me? And then Genpai says, you volunteered. And then Shin says, you're so brave, heart. I respect you now, Nobu. And Masato's like, I just can't do it. I'm sorry. And he's like, you guys are all just tricking me into doing it. And Yasu says, if she's hurt and upset, she'll be honest and cry in front of you. Nana was really upset and said, if you don't want to betray Ren, then don't invade my heart anymore. Yasu's thinking about that moment. And then he's like, we're counting on you. And then the think boxes say, "Hey Nana, even if there's nothing I can do, I want to share your loneliness with you. Please, hold my hand once more." And we get a shot of Rira and Ren sitting on either one of their beds, and he's playing the guitar and she's just singing, and they're just laughing together. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Like, comment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you are interested in supporting me monetarily, I do have a Ko-fi and a Patreon linked here on my About page. But other than that, I will see you all in the next one. Good night.